What would you do if you woke up in a world you had never seen, surrounded by women who held weapons and spoke a language you didn't know?
What if the only thing standing between them and extinction was a pocket knife with a red handle and 23 years of accumulated human knowledge?
His last memory was the screech of wet brakes and the white glare of headlights coming too fast.
Then came darkness, and then came a sky too blue and too clear, without a single airplane in sight. He opened his eyes, lying on grass that smelled real, in a body that felt like someone else's, in a world that was entirely new. His muscles ached and his joints protested, but his mind worked exactly as it always had.
Sharp, methodical, hungry for information. He stood, looked around, chose the direction where the trees grew thinnest, and started walking.
11,400 steps later, the scent of smoke drifted from the north.
He adjusted his direction without hesitation, and 20 minutes after that, saw the palisade through the trees.
Darkened logs about 2 meters high, and in several places the planks had simply rotted through. He stopped, watched, and 4 minutes later, a figure appeared on the observation deck.
A woman, a bow in her hands, an arrow already on the string.
He raised his palms, stood still, and held her gaze without flinching. She shouted something in a language he had never heard, but the meaning was unmistakable.
He smiled inwardly. Language was just a system, and he knew how to hack systems.
The gate opened a minute later, and behind it stood 7 women with weapons raised.
The tallest one stepped forward. No fear in her eyes. No warmth either.
She spoke briefly, harshly, and the others didn't move or breathe while she did. This was the leader, and one wrong move would close those gates forever.
He reached slowly into his pocket and drew out the only thing he had brought with him from his old life.
A pocket knife with a red handle. He placed it on the ground in front of him, stepped back, and showed empty palms. A young woman with reddish hair stepped forward, but the chieftain stopped her with a single word. The girl shook her head, picked up the knife, and examined it with open curiosity rather than fear. She said something, and the chieftain's expression shifted by a fraction of a degree. That fraction was enough. The chief looked at him for a long time. He didn't blink or look away. She spoke one word, and 2 women took him by the arms and led him inside.
The settlement was smaller than he had expected. 14 houses, 1 large communal building, gardens that were overgrown and half empty.
The well stood in the center, its wooden frame old, its rope almost worn through. He saw problems everywhere, and behind every problem he saw a solution they didn't yet know.
They sat him down inside the large house, and the chief sat across from him and waited.
He began to speak in his own language, slowly, clearly, illustrating every word with his hands. He pointed to the garden, mimed loosening soil, showed the spacing between rows. The red-haired girl watched his hands with such focus that he knew she would remember everything. The chief didn't stop him, and not being stopped was the first sign the door wasn't completely closed. He smiled inwardly. All he needed was time, just a little of it. He had 23 years of accumulated human knowledge in a world where they had none of it.
They thought they had let a vagabond in.
They didn't know they had let in an entire era.
That night, they fed him and gave him a corner in the communal house.
He lay in the dark and made a list of 12 priority tasks in order. First was language. Second was trust. Third was food. Everything else would come after.
He closed his eyes, and in the darkness, he could already see what didn't yet exist here, but surely would.
He woke before dawn and walked the perimeter in silence while no one was watching. He counted 9 weak spots in the palisade, where the planks were held together by nothing more than a promise. The garden covered about 400 square meters, and barely half of it was planted. The well rope would last another month at most. He returned to the hearth and waited. The first to appear was the red-haired girl, carrying firewood. She stopped when she saw him, thought for exactly 1 second, then simply continued on her way.
He noted it as a starting point for working with her.
He pointed to himself and said his name. She repeated it with an accent, but accurately.
She pointed to herself. Ha-na. 2 syllables, a soft beginning and an open ending. The name settled into his memory immediately and firmly.
For 2 hours, they named everything around them in turn. Fire, water, earth, tree, knife, bread, house.
He recorded the sounds like rows in a table, building the skeleton of the language.
By breakfast, he had 40 words and a rough structure for 2-part phrases.
When the chieftain appeared and saw the 2 of them, she paused.
She spoke to Hana. Hana answered briefly. The chief turned her gaze back to him.
He stood and bowed his head just enough to show respect without submission. So-won, that was her name. A firm beginning and a closed end. The name sounded like both a command and a warning.
He pointed to the garden, said the word for earth, and made a gesture for growth. She understood. He could see it, but she didn't want to show it yet.
He didn't wait for her permission.
He simply picked up the tool leaning against the wall and walked outside.
They thought he was asking for permission, and they didn't know he had already made the decision for them. He loosened the soil in neat rows with the correct spacing, and the difference from how they did it was immediately apparent.
10 minutes later, Hana stood beside him, watching his hands with complete concentration. He handed her the tool and showed her the grip, the angle, and the amount of force for each motion.
She repeated it exactly right, on the first attempt. He nodded. She understood, without needing a translation.
So-won watched from the gate for nearly half an hour without moving or saying a word.
Then she called over 2 more women, and they approached the garden in silence.
By noon, the properly cultivated area had tripled in size, and this was visible without any words at all.
By lunchtime, he knew 90 words and could string together simple phrases of 3 or 4 parts.
So-won sat across from him at the midday meal, and he caught the moment when she almost smiled.
Almost. Then she closed it off immediately, but he had seen it.
In the evening, he asked Hana to show him the grain stores. Hana checked with So-won first. So-won was silent for a long time.
Then she stood, led him to the warehouse herself, and opened the door.
He went inside, and his chest tightened.
There was very little grain, 6 weeks at the current rate of consumption, and still time until the next harvest.
He smiled because the task had become concrete, and he always solved concrete problems.
So-won looked at his smile, and in her eyes was a question she didn't yet know how to ask.
He spoke 3 words in her language. They meant something like, "It will be okay."
She didn't answer. She turned and left.
But she left the warehouse door open, and that was enough. The next morning, he recounted everything with precise attention.
47 kilograms of grain, 12 of beans, enough dried herbs, 19 women and 3 children. Daily rations already too low.
3 minutes of mental calculation produced a result that was unpleasant but not catastrophic.
With proper distribution and new crops, the supplies would stretch 9 weeks instead of 6.
3 extra weeks, exactly what he needed.
He found So-won early and laid stones on the ground.
2 groups, a line between them drawn with 1 finger.
First group, what they had. Second group, what they needed. The line? Time.
So-won looked at the stones and counted quickly, and that pleased him.
She gestured.
How much time?
He pointed to the sun and traced its arc 7 times. 7 weeks until the first real result with proper planting.
An honest answer. No embellishment.
So-won swept the stones aside with her palm, stood, and called everyone over. The women gathered fast. She spoke briefly and firmly. Nobody interrupted. Then she pointed at him and spoke a few words, and everyone looked his way. Hana whispered the translation. She knows, and we listened to him.
He stepped forward and laid out the plan, using gestures and the words he already had.
A new planting schedule, gathering wild plants, fishing.
The river was 400 meters from the settlement.
He had seen it the day before. It was full of water. When he made the gesture for fish, several women exchanged glances.
One raised her hand and spoke, Hana translating.
They rarely went to the river because the bank was exposed, and an exposed bank meant danger.
He added it to his list as item 4, set it aside for now, and returned to the garden.
They worked all day, he demonstrated, and they repeated. By evening, the planted area had doubled.
One woman named Twera worked faster than all the others and with the most ferocity.
The tool in her hands moved like a weapon. She was taller than the rest and moved differently.
He marked her separately on his mental map. That evening, Hana taught him another 30 words by firelight, and he repeated each one until it was precise. By the end, he had 140 words.
So-won sat off to the side, pretending not to listen, but listening to every single word.
Before sleep, he walked over to her and spoke his first complete sentence in her language, without a single mistake.
He said they needed to go to the river tomorrow, that he would go first, that he needed only one person.
So-won looked at him, and something shifted in her gaze.
She spoke one word. That word meant good.
It was the first word she had ever said to him directly, without an intermediary.
He turned and went to sleep, and behind him was a silence without any hostility in it. He rose an hour before dawn.
8 meters of rope, a knife. That was everything he could take.
Choira was already waiting at the gate, and he wasn't surprised.
So-won had chosen her, and it was the right choice. He noted that the chief knew how to read people.
Choira looked at him with cold, professional assessment. No warmth, no hostility. She held her spear in her right hand and moved like someone who had done this 1,000 times.
He nodded. She nodded back. They walked out through the gate without a single unnecessary word.
The forest received them in fog, and every sound was muffled, and every shadow doubled.
Choira walked half a step behind and to his right, covering that sector automatically.
He walked slowly, reading the tracks on the ground. The tracks were old, no immediate danger.
The river appeared through the trees sooner than expected, heard before it was seen. The bank was open, exactly as they had described. To the left, a trail led into the forest, heavily trodden.
He crouched to examine the trail, and Shaira stood beside him watching in silence.
The tracks were male, many of them, fresh, no more than 2 days old.
He looked up at Choira. She was already looking at him. Her eyes carried the same information his did.
She spoke a word he didn't yet know, said it twice, made a gesture of danger. He memorized the word and nodded, and both of them stepped back from the trail into the shade of the trees without rushing.
He surveyed the riverbank from cover and chose a spot 200 meters upstream.
The bank was screened by bushes, and the approach to the water was narrow, invisible from outside. They made their way there quietly. He checked the water. There were fish. Enough to start. He cut a few flexible branches and began weaving a primitive fishing line while Choira watched.
20 minutes later, he had something functional enough, and he lowered it into the current.
Choira stood with her back to him the entire time, facing the forest, spear held horizontal.
She was guarding him without being asked, simply because she understood it was necessary right then.
He smiled. People like her were worth more than any resource.
They thought he had come for fish, and they didn't know he had come to observe the threat up close.
2 hours, 11 fish. A good result. Choira acknowledged it with a single glance.
On the way back, he walked slowly, thinking about the trail and the fresh tracks and who had left them.
A settlement without men in a world where men carried weapons wasn't just a weakness.
It was an invitation. Someone already knew about this settlement and had been walking nearby, watching.
For now, and for now was the key phrase. They returned before noon. So-won met them at the gate, and her gaze fell immediately on the fish. Then she looked at Choira, who spoke one word. So-won tensed instantly. He intervened and spoke a phrase in her language he had been preparing the whole walk back.
He said he had seen something,
that they needed to talk tonight, and that it was important.
So-won looked at him for a long time. Then she took the fish and handed it to the woman standing nearby.
She said one word. That word meant tonight, then turned and went about her business.
Choira watched her go, then looked at him, and in her eyes was something new. Not yet trust, but something like acceptance. And that was enough on the fourth day. Evening came, and he was already at the large table when So-won entered and closed the door.
Choira followed, Hana after her. The last to enter was an elderly woman named Yoon-hee. He hadn't known that Yoon-hee was a separate power, and that was his first mistake in this world. She sat at the head of the table, and So-won didn't stop her, which told him everything about the power structure here.
Yoon-hee looked at him for a long time, and in her gaze was something that resembled recognition.
That put him on guard.
He spoke using every word he knew, gestures filling all the gaps. He explained about the trail, about the tracks, about how they were fresh, about someone circling nearby. So-won listened without interrupting. Her expression didn't change, but her fingers on the table curled slowly into a fist.
Choira confirmed his words in a single sentence, and that sentence carried more weight than all his arguments.
Yoon-hee spoke at length, and he understood half of it, and half was enough. She said the tracks had appeared 3 weeks ago, that at first there were fewer, but now there were more. He smiled inwardly. They had known and stayed silent, and that meant fear was stronger than any plan. He stood, walked to the wall, picked up a piece of charcoal from the hearth, and began drawing directly on the wood. The settlement, the river, the trail, the forest around it. All 4 cardinal directions for memory. Then 3 lines of defense. Each line was a boundary between the settlement and the threat. So-won stood up and came over and read the drawing like a military map. He pointed to the first line, surveillance. She nodded. The second, a reinforced palisade. The third, an interposition. That was the bare minimum.
Choira pointed at the trail on the drawing and looked at him questioningly.
He responded with a gesture meaning trap. She narrowed her eyes and, for the first time, nodded slightly.
Yoon-hee watched from the table, then uttered a single phrase very quietly.
Hana whispered the translation. He thinks like someone who has fought before. He didn't respond to that. He continued explaining the plan, each step fitting into a clear sequence. First, reconnaissance of the full perimeter by 2-person teams for 3 consecutive days. Second, repairing the palisade, starting with the 9 weak spots he had found on the very first morning.
Third, primitive signal traps along the trail that made noise but didn't kill yet.
Fourth, night watch shifts, and that was the least popular item on the entire list. So-won listened. When he finished, she turned to the others and spoke briefly and firmly for 3 minutes. In those 3 minutes, she assigned all 4 tasks to specific people. Choira received reconnaissance and repairs. She accepted without a word, merely straightening her back slightly.
Hana received coordination and supply. She nodded and was already making a list in her head.
Yoon-hee received nothing, and that too was a decision.
He noted that So-won was keeping her separate. When everyone left, So-won stayed behind and looked at the drawing on the wall.
He stood nearby in silence.
She spoke a phrase he understood almost completely. Why do you need to help us?
He replied in her language, slowly and with mistakes, but with the meaning coming through clearly.
He said he needed a place, that the place needed to be protected, and that it was one and the same task. So-won looked at him for a few more seconds, then turned and walked toward the door. Stopped. She said one word over her shoulder without turning around. That word in her language meant, okay. He got up before dawn, picked up a tool, and went straight to the weakest point of the palisade.
The 9th spot from the north. 3 boards held up by literally 1 rotten nail.
He started working and didn't wait for anyone. 20 minutes later, 2 women stood beside him and silently joined in. He remembered them by their positions and the way they held their tools rather than by their names. The one with the axe worked precisely and efficiently, and he put her to cutting new logs immediately.
By sunrise, the first spot was finished. They moved to the second, and the pace was already faster.
Choira arrived when the sun had risen a quarter of the way across the sky and brought 3 more with her.
She inspected his work at the first spot, walked around it from both sides, and nodded once.
A single nod from Choira was worth more than praise from anyone else, and he already understood that.
He handed her a list of all 9 points, drawn on bark with charcoal, the previous evening.
She studied it for 1 minute and assigned people to every point without a single unnecessary word or gesture. He smiled inwardly. She had taken his system and made it its own, and that was exactly right.
They thought he was building a fence, and they didn't know he was building the first line of a future kingdom.
By noon, 5 of 9 points were secured, a solid result for the first day of work.
He stepped away from the palisade and set to work on alarm traps.
Hana brought rope and dry branches without asking unnecessary questions, and he appreciated that. He explained the principle using his fingers, and she understood on the second demonstration.
A taut rope, suspended stones, the slightest touch, and the crash would wake the entire camp.
Not lethal, not cruel, just loud.
They set 4 traps on the trail to the river and 2 on the western approach.
Hana worked beside him, and he taught her the words they needed as they went.
3 hours of work and 25 new words. He could now build phrases of 5 and 6 parts.
The language came quickly because its structure was logical, and he could see through logic. On the way back to the settlement, Hana stopped and pointed to a tree by the western trail. Notches in the bark. Fresh. Made deliberately. At human height. 3 notches. A simple but unmistakable symbol. A mark. And the mark meant someone hadn't just passed by. They had claimed the territory.
Hana looked at him, and there was fear in her eyes, but she didn't move. She stood still.
And that was important. He calmly cut away the marked bark and tossed it into the bushes, then placed a trap directly in its spot.
Back at the settlement, he found So-won immediately and showed her the piece of bark he had brought.
She looked at the mark. Her expression didn't change, but the muscles in her jaw tightened. Yoon-hee appeared from behind, looked at the bark, and uttered a name. A name, not just a word. He didn't know that name yet, and didn't know what lay behind it, but Yoon-hee's tone suggested a great deal lay behind it.
So-won looked at him, and for the first time, there was something in her gaze that resembled concern for him.
She spoke the phrase slowly and clearly. Hana translated quietly. The phrase meant, "They already know about you."
He took the piece of bark and threw it into the fire. Watched it burn.
Then turned to So-won and spoke the phrase he had been preparing all day, without a single mistake.
He said, "Let them know. Let them come. We will be ready." And that is not up for discussion today.
So-won looked at the fire, then at him, and for the first time, there was neither question nor doubt in her gaze.
The night passed quietly. The traps didn't trigger, and that was good news only at first glance. He lay listening to the darkness and thinking about the name Yoon-hee had spoken by the fire.
Kangju. The name sounded like both a verdict and a long-settled matter.
In the morning, he found Yoon-hee before anyone else. She was sitting by her house, looking east. She wasn't surprised when he sat beside her. She had been waiting. He said the name slowly and questioningly. She looked at him and began to speak. She spoke at length, and he understood half of it. He stopped her with a gesture, and she repeated it more simply. The story came together in pieces. Each piece was heavier than the last. Kangju was the chieftain of a clan 2 days' journey to the east, with about 80 men under his command.
3 years ago, he had come to this settlement when there were twice as many people here.
He proposed an alliance. His alliance meant submission, tribute, and a permanent presence of his men inside.
So-won refused him. He left. A month later, a plague arrived and wiped out half the settlement in 2 weeks. Yoon-hee uttered the next phrase very quietly. Hana, who had appeared behind them, translated.
The phrase meant, "We don't know if the plague was accidental."
And it hung in the air like an unresolved question. He sat with it, and the picture assembled itself into something concrete and very bad. 80 men against 19 women, 3 children, and himself. That wasn't a war.
That was a formality. He smiled, and Yoon-hee looked at his smile, and in her eyes was a question without words.
They thought he was calculating the odds, and they didn't know he was already changing the terms of the challenge. 80 men were a force only if they all came at once, along a single path, at a time convenient to them.
None of those conditions were fixed. Each one could be broken in advance.
He asked Yoon-hee to describe the road to Kangju's clan, and she did. Forest, river, a ford, an open field, then forest again.
The ford was the only place where a large detachment could cross within a few hours' march. He marked it in his mind as the key point.
When So-won emerged from the large house and saw the two of them, she paused for a second.
Then she walked over and sat beside them and simply began to listen.
Within an hour, he had a clear picture of the threat.
Kangju didn't strike quickly. He applied pressure first, watched to see if the target would come to him on its own. The marks on the trees were the first wave. The second and third would follow, escalating. They had time, about 2 weeks until his next move.
2 weeks was long if you knew what to do, short if you were only waiting and afraid.
He stood and looked at So-won and spoke the words he had been forming while listening to Yoon-hee. He said they needed allies, that allies existed, and that he knew where to find them and how to speak with them. So-won's gaze held skepticism, but behind the skepticism was something that resembled hope.
Yoon-hee quietly spoke one phrase. Hana translated.
The phrase meant, "He speaks like a man who has a plan." He turned and walked toward the palisade, and behind him he heard So-won get up and follow.
That night, he drew a map, and by morning, everything Yoon-hee had described was on a piece of bark.
Forest, river, ford, field, the Kangju clan to the east.
And to the west, an empty space. And that empty space interested him more than anything else on the map.
Yoon-hee had mentioned in passing that there was a small settlement to the west, then fell silent.
He remembered that pause. In the morning, he sat beside her again, and her finger landed precisely on the west.
She said the name.
He gestured. How many people? She showed 10 twice, then added the gesture for women, 20 women living separately to the west. The 2 settlements hadn't spoken in a long time. He asked why.
Yoon-hee paused, then spoke one word.
2 settlements of surviving women in the same forest, with only pride standing between them. It was absurd. So-won had been listening from the wall, and when he looked at her, she looked away. He walked over, placed the map in front of her, and pointed to the western settlement without a word. She looked at the map, then at him, and in her gaze was a struggle she never showed to anyone. He said slowly and clearly, "The Kangju clan alone is stronger than us. 2 settlements together are stronger than it." The math was simple, and So-won was smart. She understood it as well as he did.
She was silent for a long time, then spoke one word. Who would go there to speak?
He pointed to himself. She shook her head and pointed to Choira, then back to him. Choira received the news without emotion and only asked when. He replied, "Tomorrow at dawn."
He spent the rest of the day preparing and thinking about how to speak to people who didn't know him.
A stranger asking for an alliance is a sign of weakness, and weakness convinces no one in any world. He needed to come not with a request, but with a proposal, concrete and valuable. He asked Hana to gather everything they could take as gifts or demonstration. She brought dried herbs, fish, and a piece of cloth the women wove from local fibers. He examined it all, added a few things of his own, and by evening had a small but well-thought-out assortment.
Yoon-hee came before bedtime and placed a small carved wooden token in his hand. She closed his fingers around it and whispered a phrase Hana translated.
The phrase meant, "This is the symbol of our settlement. They will recognize it there. It will open the door."
He looked at Yoon-hee, and in her eyes was something she hadn't said and would never say aloud.
She knew the people in that settlement. The bond between them was an old one, and this was her map, not his.
In the morning, Choira and he set out before dawn, the forest receiving them in fog and silence.
This time, Choi Ra walked beside him instead of behind him, and he noticed that silent change.
They walked for 3 hours. He counted his steps and read the forest like a familiar text. The settlement of Sodom appeared suddenly. Their palisade was taller and sturdier than their own. 2 women stood at the gate with bows drawn and arrows nocked, and they did not lower their weapons at the sight of the pair.
Chora, and he stopped in the open, motionless, and waited. He raised his hand holding Yoon-hee's carved token and held it where the gate could see.
One of the guards tensed and shouted something inside, and a minute later, the gate opened.
The woman who stepped out was short, calm, and held her hands loosely, confident, not careless. Her name was Ren. That much was clear without words, without introductions, and without ceremony.
She was the leader. He could see it in the way she looked at the 3 things before her.
First, the symbol, then Choira's familiar face, then him, the unfamiliar one.
That order of gaze told him exactly how she perceived the world.
Choira spoke a few words. Ren listened without interrupting, her expression unchanging. Then she nodded, stepped back, and gestured with her hand. "Come in." The village of Sodom was different. He read it as he walked.
The fence was sturdy and well-maintained. The garden was larger than theirs. The well was new.
These were signs of order, but few people moved on the street, and those who did moved quietly, eyes down. Signs of fear.
Rin led them into the communal house, sat them down, sat across, and waited.
Choira spoke, and he understood 3/4 of it, which was almost enough.
She spoke of Kangju, of the marks, of how neither settlement would survive until spring alone.
Rin listened. When Choira finished, Rin asked one question, directed at him. He understood it completely. "Who are you? Where did you come from? And why do you need this?"
He answered in her language, slowly and with pauses, and only what was true.
He said he had come from a distant place, found Sowan's settlement, and saw what could be built. Rin looked at him while he spoke, and in her gaze there was business, not emotion. He liked that.
When he finished, she asked the next question, sharper and more direct than the first.
She asked what he wanted in return, and that question contained the whole essence of their conversation. He smiled, took out the map on bark, placed it between them, and smoothed it with his palm.
He pointed to Sowan's settlement, to Sodom, to the Kangju clan, and drew a line connecting all 3.
Then he pointed to the empty space around them and said the word for space.
Ren looked at the map, and he could see she understood and thought the same way he did. 2 settlements together were not just protection. They were an opportunity to grow in ways impossible alone.
He laid everything he had brought on the table and explained each item. Herbs, fish, the cloth, and the new planting technique he had introduced to Sowan's settlement.
Ren picked up the cloth and ran her finger along the weave, spoke a short phrase. Her assistant stood from the wall, left, and returned 3 minutes later with a piece of their own fabric.
She placed it beside theirs. Coarser, looser weave, a different technique.
He pointed to their fabric, then to hers, and made the gesture for teaching.
Ren watched and was silent for a long time. Fire. Breathing. Nothing else. Then she spoke a phrase that made Choira tense slightly.
Choira translated quietly, "We know more about Kangju than you do, and this is our price."
He looked at Ren. She looked at him. Between them lay the map and its empty spaces. He nodded once and said one word. That word meant, "Speak."
Rin spoke at length, every word precise, every fact verified. You could feel it.
Kangju was preparing for a campaign. His men had been gathering supplies and sharpening weapons for 2 weeks straight.
The time he had given the settlement was wrong. Not 2 weeks, less than 10 days.
He sat and listened, tallying everything they had managed to do against everything they hadn't yet begun.
The palisade was secure at 7 of 9 points. Traps were set on 2 trails. It wasn't enough. Rin added the most important detail at the end. Choira translated, and her voice was steady, but her fingers tightened. Kangju knew a man had appeared in the settlement, had known it for 4 days, and that changed everything.
He smiled inwardly because it meant Kangju's intelligence was working, which meant his had to work better.
They thought surprise was on their side, and they didn't know he already knew more about them than they realized.
He stood, pointed at the map, and said one word. Ford.
Rin nodded immediately.
The ford was the only place where 80 people could cross the river quickly and together without heavy losses.
Controlling the ford meant controlling the timing, the pace, and the direction of everything that followed. He explained this using the map and gestures, and a new look appeared in Rin's eyes.
Not surprise, something closer to a reassessment.
She spoke a phrase. Choira translated. Rin was providing 4 of her best scouts. Not just help, the first real step toward a genuine alliance. He accepted with a nod, took the charcoal, and added new observation points around the ford to the map. 3 positions on different banks and 1 on high ground with a coded sound signal between them.
Ren looked at the diagram, then took the charcoal from his hand and added a 5th point he had missed. He looked at her choice. She was right. The 5th point covered the blind spot from the northeast.
He nodded. She returned the charcoal. In that small exchange lay the whole reason he had come here. They left Sodom an hour later, and the 4 scouts followed them in silence, moving like shadows. Choira glanced at them, and he could see her assessing them. Her assessment was positive.
On the way back, he thought about the ford and what needed to be done there before Kangju moved.
The ford couldn't be blocked, but it could be made slow, inconvenient, and predictable. A few logs upstream could subtly alter the depth and current at the crossing. Rocks, rearranged correctly, could force those crossing into a narrow line instead of a broad front. A narrow line meant 80 people stretching into a long column, losing the advantage of their numbers. They returned to the settlement before sunset. Sowan was at the gate. Her gaze fell on the 4 unfamiliar women. He spoke one word, alliance. Sowan looked at him for 3 seconds, then nodded.
That evening, he gathered everyone and explained the plan using the map.
Choira was assigned to scout the ford, and the 4 women from Sodom came under her command immediately.
Hana was put in charge of supplies and medicine. Her expression told him she had already been thinking about it.
Sowan listened, and when he finished, she stood and gave one order he hadn't anticipated.
She doubled the night watch and moved the children to the central house. The right call.
Yoon-hee sat in the corner and looked at him, and in her gaze was something between relief and anxiety. He approached her afterward and she whispered one sentence, without a translator nearby. He understood it himself. It meant, he doesn't know you're here yet, and when he finds out, things will get much worse. He looked at the fire and replied in her language, I know, and I am waiting for it. He rose 2 hours before dawn, took a rope and a knife, and walked out through the gate alone.
Choira called from her post. He raised his hand. She nodded and said nothing more.
400 meters to the ford, and he walked slowly, reading the forest. The river appeared between the trees, and the water was black in the night, and the current was audible, but not strong. He stepped in, and the cold hit immediately. He waited, counting his steps and reading the bottom with his feet like a map. 18 meters wide, waist deep at the center, an even rocky bottom. An even bottom makes for an easy crossing, and easy crossing is an advantage for whoever goes first.
He spent an hour in the water, moving stones, altering the bottom's contour methodically.
3 narrow passages instead of 1 wide one, with invisible pits between them, deep enough to reach an adult's chest.
Whoever led would find the first passage and then the second, but would not find the third.
And that would disrupt the pace of the entire crossing. 80 people through 3 narrow passages wasn't a wave, it was a stream.
And a stream could be stopped with minimal effort.
He stepped onto the bank, lay on the ground, and looked at the water, already calculating the next move. The elevation on the north bank was 40 meters from the ford, and from there, the entire crossing was in full view.
Not arrows, because there weren't enough arrows, but stones, noise, and shouts.
Panic in water wasn't just casualties, it was a standstill. And a standstill at a ford under pressure was chaos.
He returned before dawn and found Choi Ra, explaining everything using the map and gestures.
She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked one question. Precise. Military.
How many people were needed to hold the ford?
He said 8. She narrowed her eyes.
8 against 80 at a prepared position. That wasn't madness, it was math, and she knew it.
She nodded and named 4 of her own and 4 of the Sodom scouts.
That was correct.
News arrived in the morning from a Sodom scout who had been on duty at the eastern outpost overnight.
She spoke quickly, and Shora translated in pieces, and each piece was worse than the last.
Kangju had set out during the night. His men were marching through the darkness.
Estimated time to reach the ford, 6 hours.
6 hours, not 10 days. He ran through everything that was ready and everything that wasn't in a single minute.
Palisade fully closed, traps set, reconnaissance in position. 8 fighters at the ford. That was it.
He found So-won and said one sentence, "They are coming."
She looked at him calmly, didn't pale, didn't lose composure. She turned and began giving orders, her voice firm and even, and the settlement sprang into action within 3 minutes. Everyone knew their place because they had been preparing for exactly this.
He took Hana aside and said there would be wounded and everything needed to be ready now.
She nodded, no fear in her eyes, only focus, and he felt at ease with her. Yun-hee approached and placed the same wooden token in his hand that she had given before the trip to Sodom. She whispered one phrase. He understood it completely.
It meant, come back.
And it was important.
He clenched the token, put it in his pocket, and turned toward the gate where Choira was already waiting.
2 of them walked out, followed by 6 others, and the forest closed behind them. They took up their position on the hill 40 minutes before the first figures appeared on the eastern bank. He lay in the grass and counted, a vanguard of 12 men, moving cautiously.
12 in front, the main body behind. A correct marching order. Kangju knew his business.
Choira lay beside him, breathing evenly. The spear in her hand was parallel to the ground. She was ready. The advance party reached the ford. The first man stepped in and found the first passage without difficulty.
Then the second, then the third. Confidence. Exactly what he had wanted.
The fourth stepped off course and sank chest deep, cursing, and the formation broke instantly.
The rest stopped, shouting, pointing. The vanguard huddled at the shore. He smiled quietly. The chaos at the crossing had begun sooner than expected. That was good.
They thought the ford was the same as always, and they didn't know the ford had changed completely that night.
The main column approached the bank, and he saw a man walking in the center, commanding with gestures. Large, moving with that heavy confidence found only in people accustomed to winning. Kangju. He saw him for the first time and memorized every detail. His silhouette, how he carried his weapon.
Kangju surveyed the stragglers and shouted, and his men began to search the passages methodically.
A methodical search takes time, and time was no longer working in their favor.
He turned to Choira and nodded. She passed the signal silently with one touch of a shoulder. The first stone flew from the northern position and struck the water near those searching, sending up a splash. A second stone,
A third, fast and accurate. The people in the water screamed and scrambled back.
Kangju bellowed a command, and several men raised their bows. Arrows flew toward the hill.
He was already rolling down the slope, and the arrows flew over where he had been lying a second before.
Choira rolled the other direction. The Sodom scouts scattered silently among the trees.
The arrows searched for them and couldn't find them because they weren't standing still.
That was the first rule.
Kangju shouted again, and the vanguard began crossing all 3 passages at once.
9 in the water, 2 already making their way to the near shore.
Choira emerged from the bushes, and her spear stopped the first one. He fell back into the current with a scream.
The second jumped back, slipped on the uneven bed, went under, and surfaced on the opposite bank.
They weren't holding the crossing by force. They were making it slow and costly, and every step took time.
Kangju stood on the eastern bank and watched. He looked at his face through a gap between the trees.
No fury, only assessment. That told him Kangju was smarter than he would have liked.
Kangju called the advance guard back with one gesture. The men came out of the water and stood waiting.
He stopped, and Choira stopped beside him, and both of them looked across at the eastern bank. Kangju raised his head and looked directly in his direction. 30 meters of river between them. Kangju couldn't see him in the shade of the trees.
Yet he was looking exactly where he was standing.
That was a signal.
Kangju spoke aloud, his voice carrying across the water, words directed specifically at him.
Choira translated quietly. Today you held me back, and tomorrow I will come for you.
He didn't answer.
He simply turned and walked toward the settlement, and Choira walked silently beside him.
Behind them, on the eastern bank, stood 80 people, and among them was a man who knew about him. They returned, and the gates closed behind them, so one was already standing inside, waiting.
She looked at all 8, counted, made sure everyone had returned. Only then did she exhale. He reported using the map and gestures, and she listened with her face still and her eyes working.
Choira added 3 sentences, and in those 3 sentences lay the full weight of what had happened at the ford.
So Juan was silent for 1 minute, then spoke one word. Tomorrow.
And everyone dispersed. He didn't sleep. He sat over the map and thought about Kangju's gaze across the river.
A man who withdraws his unit without anger after a failure is already thinking about the next move.
The next move could be a different ford upstream or downstream, and he didn't know the river well enough. He found a Sodom scout named Meaty who knew this river better than anyone in their group.
She pointed out 2 additional crossing points on the map. One, 3 hours' march to the north.
The northern crossing was shallower and wider, with no high ground for position. Bad for them.
He added both locations to the map, circled them, and drew a question mark beside each.
Around midnight, the first trap on the eastern trail triggered, and the crash of rocks woke the sentries.
Choira was already running toward the spot, and he ran after her. They got there in 2 minutes. No one was there. The trap had been sprung by someone who had come and gone.
Trampled grass nearby indicated one person traveling east. Reconnaissance, unarmed, traveling light.
Choira silently reset the trap, and they returned. She moved closer to the eastern wall.
He didn't sleep, and at 3 in the morning, the second trap triggered on the northern trail. 2 directions in a single night. That wasn't a random patrol. It was a systematic perimeter check. Kangju was assembling a complete picture before his next move.
Very little time remained.
He woke So-Won, and she opened her eyes immediately, fully, and without hesitation.
Which meant she hadn't been sleeping either.
He explained about the 2 traps, and she got up, dressed, and came out with him.
The 2 of them stood over the map, and she looked at the northern ford he had circled. She spoke quietly, and he understood her completely. If he goes north, his army will be between us and Sodom.
And that would sever the alliance. He looked at her, and in her eyes was the same map he had been reading in his own mind. And that mattered.
She was thinking strategically and thinking correctly.
He pointed to Sodom on the map and said one word, warn.
She nodded, called a name,
and 5 minutes later a Sodom scout was stepping out through the gate into the darkness.
He watched the gate close behind her and thought that tomorrow would be longer than today.
Someone stood beside him, looking in the same direction, and between them was a silence with nothing superfluous in it. The sun had not yet risen when a sound came from the direction of the northern trail. The rhythmic, muffled sound of many footsteps on frozen ground. He was on his feet before he realized he was awake, a knife already in his hand.
Twyra appeared by the wall a minute later, and her face told him she was hearing the same thing from the north.
He ran up to the lookout and looked toward the forest. In the pre-dawn dark, he saw movement. They weren't coming from the east.
They were coming from the north.
Kangju had found the northern ford during the night.
He counted a vanguard of 20 men, and behind them in the darkness, the main body moved through the trees. No time to prepare. He jumped down and grabbed So-won by the shoulder.
She was already looking north.
He said 3 words, North, Mini, now.
She turned and began shouting orders.
The settlement was awake within 2 minutes, and everyone knew their place.
That was the only thing saving them. Twyra lined up 8 people against the northern wall, with everything sharp and heavy in their hands.
Hana was already unpacking supplies for the wounded, her hands moving without a single wasted motion.
He ran back to the lookout. The advance guard was 100 meters from the palisade. And then he saw something that changed the entire picture. He stopped, looked again, counted, made sure he wasn't mistaken. Among those coming from the north, only 12 were Kangju's men.
The remaining 8 moved differently, kept their distance. 2 of them bore the insignia he had seen before.
The marks of Saim.
8 warriors from Rin's settlement had come out to meet the northern detachment in the darkness of the forest.
They hadn't attacked. They simply walked alongside Kangju's men, with exactly enough space between them.
Rin had sent people out the moment the warning arrived, and they had intercepted the detachment on the march.
He smiled. Rin thought as quickly as he did, and that meant the alliance was genuine.
They thought the northern bypass would be unexpected, and they didn't know that the north ford was already mapped.
The advance party stopped 50 meters from the palisade, and the men conferred.
8 Sodom warriors stepped out from the flank, and their position was clear. An attack on the palisade would mean 2 fronts. 12 men against the palisade, 8 inside and 8 from the flank. Bad math for them. The commander of the advance unit calculated and didn't like the result.
He raised his hand. His men came to a complete halt and stood motionless.
So-won climbed up next to him onto the observation deck and looked north, face stony, completely calm. The squad commander shouted, asking permission to retreat.
So granted it, unconditionally. He looked at her, and she sensed it and turned, a question in her eyes. He nodded. She had made the right decision. Generosity after victory was worth more than cruelty.
The squad turned and headed back into the forest, and 8 Sodom warriors escorted them to the ford in silence. The settlement exhaled, and he heard it from everyone at once.
The sound of people who had survived. Hana approached and whispered one phrase. There were no wounded. So-won stood by the wall, looking north, and he walked over and stood beside her.
Both silent, lost in thought. Kangju had lost 2 units in a single day without a single casualty. He had been testing them, looking for a weak spot, and today he had learned they had an alliance.
That would change his plan.
He spoke one phrase quietly in So-won's language, and she heard it, turned and looked at him. The phrase meant, he will come alone next, and soon. And next time, it won't be squads. Kangju came on the 3rd day. He came alone, and it was scarier than if he had brought all 80. The sentry shouted one word, and he was at the lookout in under a minute, and saw him immediately.
Kangju walked across the open field in front of the palisade, slow, hands visible and empty. He was larger than he had seen from across the river, and moved with a calm, deliberate weight money couldn't buy.
So-won stood up beside him, and he saw the muscles in her neck and shoulders tighten. She had known this man for a long time, and what was between them was older than any plan he could devise.
Kangju stopped 20 meters from the gate, raised his head, and looked straight at the two of them. He spoke, and his voice was loud and steady, each word falling separately and clearly.
Twyra translated from behind. He had come unarmed. He wanted to speak. He had words for the leader and for the stranger.
He pronounced stranger distinctly, looked straight at him, and that single glance contained his full assessment.
So-won replied briefly. She was listening, and he could speak from there.
Kangju smiled slightly and continued, speaking more slowly now.
He said his 2 units had returned without losses, that he had noticed that, and that it was a choice, not a weakness.
He said he saw the alliance with Sodom and that he respected those who thought quickly and acted before the enemy.
Then he said the most important thing, and his voice didn't change at all.
And that was worse than if he had shouted.
He said that behind him stood not 80 men, but 200, and they would arrive in 7 days.
200. He didn't change expression. He counted what they had, and the result was grim.
27 fighters, including Sodom. 200 against 27 was a different kind of math.
Kangju fell silent and stood there waiting. The wind ruffled his hair, and he didn't move, just looked directly at him.
He was waiting for his answer. Not So-won's. His.
And that was also part of the pressure. So-won turned to him, and there was no fear in her gaze, only a question. And that question was his to answer.
He walked down from the platform, nodded to the guard, and the gate opened just wide enough. He stepped out alone and stood 10 meters from Kangju, with the open field between them. They looked at each other. Kangju was about 10 years older and broader in the shoulders.
And in his eyes was the weariness of people who always won. He spoke in the language he had been learning for 12 days, slowly, but without a single unnecessary pause.
He said he had heard the words, that 200 was too many, that 7 days was too few, and that he was proposing something else.
Kangju listened without interrupting, and his expression didn't change until he reached the main point.
Then his eyes narrowed slightly. He said that in 7 days, Kangju would have not 2 settlements against him, but 4.
And he let Kangju do the math himself.
It was a lie and the truth at the same time, because there weren't 4 settlements yet.
But there could be if he moved fast enough.
Kangju was silent for a long time and looked at him, and he held the gaze without blinking or looking away even once.
Then Kangju spoke one phrase, turned, and walked back across the field without looking back. Choira translated quietly. "We will see, stranger, in 7 days."
He watched Kangju's back and counted. 7 days to turn a bluff into real power.
He walked back through the gate and spoke immediately. 7 days. A to-do list for every day. Starting now.
So-won repeated his words to her people, and her voice didn't waver once.
Choyera looked at him with the unspoken question he answered before she asked.
2 more settlements. Fast.
Yunhee rose from the bench and uttered one word, and everyone looked at her.
The word was a name, Bekso, and in it there was something ancient and long forgotten. He looked at Yunhee and she nodded, and he understood she had known more than she had said all along.
They sat together, and she spoke slowly, and he filled the gaps himself from context.
Bekso was a settlement to the south, a full day's journey, with about 30 people, including men.
Men! The first settlement with men in all 16 days, and it changed everything instantly.
Yunhee's next sentence came with a warning wrapped inside it.
The men in Bekso were merchants, not warriors. They feared Kangju as much as everyone around them did.
Fear wasn't an alliance, but fear could be turned into one if he showed there was less to fear on their side. He walked to the map and marked Bekso to the south, then drew a line connecting all 4 settlements.
The line closed into a quadrilateral, and Kangju sat outside it.
So Wan looked at the geometry on the map and understood what that shape meant on the ground.
4 settlements weren't just an alliance, they were a territory.
And a territory was the beginning of something greater.
He said the word for border in their language, and Sowan looked at him and was silent for a long time.
Then she said another word. That word meant kingdom.
And the room grew very quiet.
Tuera looked at the map and at the word hanging in the air, and something in her face changed.
Hana pressed her hand to her chest and looked at Sowan with that feeling when the impossible becomes real.
He gave them 10 seconds, then spoke again, because the kingdom was 7 days away. Not now. Day 1, a trip to Bexo with Tuera and 2 Sodom warriors for weight.
Day 2, fortifying the northern approach. Sowan was already nodding before he finished the sentence.
Days 3 and 4, preparing positions around the settlement with exact placements, methods, and reasons.
Day 5, a general assembly of all allies, joint training, one unified alarm signal across all 4 settlements.
Day 6, a final check of everything. Day 7, waiting. And waiting was work too.
So Wan listened to the entire list, then stood and spoke one sentence calmly and clearly.
If you make a mistake with the 4th settlement, we will all die.
She was right. He looked at So-Wan and replied in her language, short and without promises.
He said, "I will not make a mistake," and turned toward the exit, hearing So-Wan issue her first orders behind him. In the morning, he walked out with Tuera and 2 warriors, and ahead of them lay a full day's march south to Bexo.
The forest changed as they headed south, trees growing sparser, trails between them showing wheel ruts. Real roads, and wheel ruts meant trade, regular and long-established trade.
Tuera noticed the same details and drew the same conclusions and kept them to herself.
They reached the settlement an hour before sunset, and Bexo was larger than expected. A wide palisade, warehouses, sheds, smoke from several hearths, signs of commerce and activity.
A man stood at the gate, middle-aged, broad-shouldered, with the caution of someone used to trade.
He raised his palm forward. The man responded in kind, a universal gesture, a good sign.
Inside, Bexo was lively and full of the smell of food, leather, wood, and smoke. About 35 people, 9 men, merchants, judging by their posture and their hands.
They were led to an elder named Han Gil, sitting at a large table covered in papers.
Papers, the first he had seen in this world. Symbols and numbers, the language of trade.
Han Gil looked at him with the same interest with which he looked at the papers. An honest exchange.
Han Gil had heard about So-Wan's settlement, about the stranger who had arrived, about what had happened at the ford. News traveled fast, which meant Han Gil had a network, active and alive.
A merchant with a living network of contacts was worth more than a dozen warriors.
They thought he had come to ask for protection, and they didn't know he had come to offer something better. He asked Tuera to convey one question, simple and direct, without polite pretense.
How much does Bexo lose every time Kangju blocks the trade routes?
Han Gil was silent. Something shifted in his eyes and shifted fast.
He answered, and the figure he named was large, and the pain as he said it was genuine.
He nodded, drew the quadrilateral of 4 settlements on bark right on the table, showed where Kangju sat, and where the trade routes crossed his territory.
Then he drew the same routes running inside the quadrilateral between the allied settlements.
Han Gil looked at the drawing and calculated. Not people, not weapons, but goods and routes. A merchant calculates differently from a warrior, and differently from a chieftain, and it was precisely that calculation he had come for.
Han Gil looked up and asked one word, guarantees.
He answered without pause, 4 settlements with 1 enemy and 1 interest.
Han Gil stood, paced the room, stopped at the window, and stared into the courtyard in silence for a long time.
Then he turned and spoke one sentence. Tuera translated with one condition.
Bexo would not go to war. They would provide food,
information, and trade routes, but not blood.
He looked at Twyera. She looked back and waited.
He turned to Hangild and Nade.
Food, information, and trade routes were more than 9 merchants with spears, and both men knew it.
Han Gil extended his hand, a gesture that required no translation.
He shook it. The agreement was sealed.
When they returned to the settlement 2 days later, So-won was at the gate and looked at their faces.
He nodded once. She exhaled. The only time he had ever seen her allow herself a moment of relief.
He gathered everyone and spoke. Bekso, the terms, 4 settlements, an alliance. The bluff had become reality.
So-won stood and began assigning tasks for what remained of the 7 days.
5 days until Kangju's arrival, and in 5 days they had to do what usually took a month.
But then again, he had never been the kind of man who needed a month to build the first line of a kingdom.